Welcome to the Commentary Magazine Daily Podcast. I'm John Podhoretz, the editor of Commentary, and this week we are highlighting some of the glories of our September issue for your perusal at commentary.org as an effort, an emotional effort, a manipulative effort, an important effort to get you to subscribe to Commentary Magazine, the heart and soul of this entire enterprise. And here today to discuss with executive editor Abe Greenwald. Hi, Abe.
Hi, John.
To discuss his seminal article in the September issue of Commentary, an important analysis of a possibly epical, world-changing series of events in the Middle East, not the war in Iran, something else, is our own contributing editor, Jonathan Schanzer, the executive director of the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. And his article is called The Saudi Choice That Will Reshape the Middle East. Two possible paths, one pro-American, one not. Where will the kingdom go? So Jonathan Schanzer, people know that there has been talk over the last 10 years of a quiet alliance of interest, if not actual alliance, between Saudi Arabia and Israel as they both confront the Shiite enemy in Tehran, and that Donald Trump, both in this administration and in his first administration and the Biden administration in its one administration, have believed that there was a pathway to a new set of alliances in the Middle East that would connect Israel, the United States, and Saudi Arabia. And you are now looking at this and seeing a real possibility of this regional alliance, except at the very same time, the Saudis are being tempted into a regional alliance whose interests would seem to diverge sharply from those of the United States and certainly of Israel. So can you elaborate?
I can. Look, I think the first thing that needs to be said up front is that normalization between Saudi and Israel, it's a process. It's not necessarily an event. And I think that process has been ongoing. And I think there have been a lot of positive signs over the years. I've been a number of times to Saudi Arabia, and I've seen not just the modernization of the country, but I've seen Israelis on the ground in the country. If you hold two passports, one is Israeli and one something else, the something else will usually get you in, and people are doing business there. And I don't think that the Saudis are against Israel's existence. I think they like the idea of being aligned with a country that can bring a lot to the table technologically, agriculturally, in terms of defense tech and everything else. I mean, there's a lot that's there. And I don't think that it's just all gone overnight. But I will say that what we're seeing right now, this new defense pact that was recently signed by Pakistan, Turkey, and Saudi Arabia, it really does look like the Saudis are snubbing Israel, and I think in the process also the United States. Now, we can get into exactly what the deal means and who they're snubbing when they do this, because it's not just Israel. But I do want to say that I think that it is the direct result of the United States underperforming in the, let's just call it the latter half of this war, that the American inability to completely vanquish the Islamic Republic on the battlefield, despite having dominated the battlefield for the first 4 or 5 weeks of this thing, I do get a sense that the Saudis are beginning to they're hedging, which is what the Saudis do all the time. They're looking for other ways to, cover their tuchus. I mean, they're trying to figure out right now what they can do to stop the onslaught of Iranian drones and missiles and the aggression in the Strait of Hormuz. And with the U.S. seemingly out of options, at least at the moment, it does look like the Saudis are looking elsewhere.
I think it's worth going back a little bit to explain just how remarkable the current situation of Saudi Arabia is vis-a-vis what Saudi Arabia has been over the last really since its independence or whatever you might call it in 1903, that my old teacher, Daniel Pipes, with whom I studied U.S.-Saudi relations in the early 1980s at the University of Chicago, once said that Saudi Arabia was the most foreign country in the world if you were an American. Having been there, having traveled there, man who spoke Arabic, all of that, that there was no country on earth more different from the United States than Saudi Arabia, a country where there were no women to be seen on the streets, where there was, it's basically a theocratic regime that had total control of all public activity, and there was very little in the way of public activity. And then so let's say that's the early 80s, and now here we are in 2026. There's a man under 40 who is the crown prince, who is running the country, who wants to build a 75-mile-long city, be a technological force and power, diversify Saudi Arabia's income stream so that it is not reliant on oil, which may be running out of, which is a finite commodity, and playing geopolitical games with the United States, Israel, playing footsie with everybody, and making so that we have this talking about Saudi Arabia as though it was a realistic prospect that Saudi Arabia would want to ally itself with Israel. Saudi Arabia was the paymaster of the plan to eradicate Israel from the face of the earth pretty much from 1948 onward. It was the money that the Palestinians got. It supplied the Palestinians with money. Henry Kissinger says in his memoir that when he went to meet King Fahd for the first time in 1973 or something like that, Fahd yelled at him for 3 hours without let up about Israel and its evil and its aggression. Like, that's all he wanted to talk about. And so here we are. So on the one hand, we're in this like wild new world in which Saudi Arabia and Israel seem to have a confluence of interests. And yet that hope, or that suddenly new set of expectations that started about 7 or 8 years ago, has been dealt a blow in the last 2 or 3 weeks, even as we were contemplating you're writing this article.
Yeah. First of all, let me just say that we should at some point have an entire episode of this podcast devoted to Daniel Pipes and all the ways that he got so many things right over the years. The man had a remarkable career. He was a mentor to me. I worked at the Middle East Forum in Philadelphia. He was my first think tank boss. He taught me a lot about this business. So we have that in common, which I don't know if we've talked about. But I think you actually kind of, you're low-keying, if I can borrow from Donald Trump, you're low-keying your description of how backward Saudi Arabia was. And how much it has grown over the last, I don't know, decade or so. I mean, it's been, 2017 when Mohammed bin Salman, or MBS as we call him, became crown prince. And he just, he has just throttled the kind of ancient Saudi Arabia out of that country. He's been driving it into the 21st century. It was deliberately backward. I mean, it's funny. I remember my first trip there, which was about the time that MBS came to power. Women were not allowed to talk to men. Everybody had the full, all the women had full covering. I remember walking into a restaurant with a male colleague, and we were turned away because we were Western men that were trying to eat there during family time. And that it was just unacceptable that we were trying to eat there. It was just so xenophobic and just so phobic of modernity and Westernism. And I remember my last trip, which was 2023, and I had a woman come up to me very aggressively as I walked through a mall, trying to sell me Victoria's Secret lingerie for my wife. And I just was so taken aback by that by going out to restaurants and seeing men and women sitting together. By then, women were allowed to drive. Women could leave the country when they never could before without having a written approval by a male guardian from their family. I mean, there was just a bunch of things that MBS has dragged the country into this century, and he deserves an enormous amount of credit. By the way, it doesn't mean that he doesn't have blood on his hands from the Khashoggi affair. It doesn't mean that he's a perfect leader. I think we can all agree that there's a mixed record here for a man like that, but he's done a lot. And as he was doing all of this, yeah, there was a lot of talk about the Saudis being on the 5-yard line of normalization. Everybody will recall that 2020 was when the Abraham Accords were signed, and it was the Saudis and the Bahrainis and the Emiratis that first joined. Then the Moroccans came in. Sudan was a brief kind of flash in the pan there, and then the country descended into civil war yet again. But we all kept talking about how the Saudis were next, and they really did seem that way. And when you talk to Saudi officials, they openly acknowledged that they were mulling this, and they really wanted to know what was in it for them and what the United States could offer. And leading up to this war, I got to say, the war beginning on February 28th, I heard a lot about the Saudis being in the ear of Donald Trump, kind of urging him to go all in on a battle with the Iranians and to eradicate the regime. They seem to be doing this in concert in some way with the Israelis. How much they were coordinating, we don't know. But you got a sense that with Trump back in power and with the Israelis already, pretty well into the war, and the Saudis understanding that there was an opportunity, it was all coming together in some way. Now, it did start to fall apart, I think, as we already mentioned, when the U.S. began to show, I don't know if we call them sort of chinks in the armor, or if it's just the limits of American power in wars against terrorist states. And we've talked about things like this on your program in the past. But yeah, it everything feels like it got disrupted, and really quickly. I mean, really quickly. When I started writing this,
I really do want to say that we talked about this piece. You came on the podcast. You said there's really interesting stuff going on. America, Israel, India, pipelines, new ways of getting oil around the Middle East to avoid the Strait of Hormuz. A new future is in the possible offing, but there is a temptation for the Saudis. But the original idea was, let's highlight this possible new thing.
Sure. Can I just because I know we're going to get into the present moment in a second. But since we started out on history, I just want to add my 2 cents here as you guys are talking. It strikes me that the change in the Saudi attitude or the Saudi plans. I don't mean the change since the war, but I mean from being the chief funder of the Palestinians and so on, and this great engine of Salafist terrorism and so on. Strikes me as it's one of the great examples in history of unintended consequences in 2 ways, in that Osama bin Laden's list of transgressions against the U.S. Was in part the U.S. Having troops on in Saudi Arabia, but that he, on the holy sands of Saudi Arabia, which he considered a monstrous crime, and after 9/11, I think was the very beginning of the sort of pivot, because the U.S. had a lot to answer for in terms of like, well, we have this sort of security for energy understanding, but we obviously, this is not going to work for us in the future. And the Saudis had to begin to make a choice, sometime around 9/11. And and the pivot, I think, began then before before the dramatic
Before the
change.
backlash.
Yeah,
Right.
and just also in one other way, Barack Obama, in his effort to put daylight between the U.S. and Israel, and in his effort to offer Iran what he called an open hand, closed out both the Saudis and the Israelis in his dealings with Iran, and that pushed now the Saudis and Israel closer together. So it's this
1,000%.
fascinating story of unintended consequences historically. Now, I'm sorry.
Absolutely. No, I mean, I'm glad you brought that up, because it really was Barack Obama who sparked this. It really was. Although I do think you're right that, the Saudis were so beaten up in this town after 9/11. I mean, they were pariahs. I will say, by the way, I mean, I've been looking at that period of time and what the Saudis endured after 9/11 as possibly a roadmap for the Israelis as they head into a hailstorm in Washington right now with, Democratic socialists and crazy right-wing Tucker Carlson lovers. And when all of these forces start to gang up on the Israelis, I think it might be instructive to actually look at how the Saudis somehow survived this. They started pivoting into American foreign policy. They started leaning into certain elements of it. And then, yes, I do think that Barack Obama helped push them there. There are those who say that, if the regime in Iran falls, then Saudi Arabia would have no reason to work with the Israelis, and that might actually destroy all hope for normalization. I'm not sure I buy that. But yeah, I mean, look, I think what we've just described here is the trajectory that the Saudis have been on, going from crazy Wahhabis and backward, an entirely backward country, as Daniel Pipes called it, a mafia family with a seat at the UN. And now here with MBS trying to bring the country to modernization. Now, I will say his Vision 2030, this idea of weaning Saudi Arabia off of oil entirely by the year 2030 and making it a knowledge-based economy and all these mega projects. Look, some of the mega projects have worked. Some are starting to fail already. And I do think that also may be part of why MBS is hedging the way that he is. You can't fail with your mega projects and normalize with Israel and have a good relationship with the United States with a population that maybe takes a dim view of all of those things. He's trying to figure out how to be more of a populist leader in real time.
Okay, so what you talk about is the optimism at the beginning of the war and in months surrounding it that something called the India Middle East Energy Corridor might come into being, IMEC. And as I said, as you describe it here, an alliance, India, the United States, the United Arab Emirates, Israel, Greece, and Cyprus, connecting Indian ports to the Persian Gulf by sea, cargo moving across the Arabian Peninsula on the ground, and shipping from Israel to Europe, thus providing an entirely new route for energy on the planet Earth, with India as the most populous, third, fourth largest economy in the world as the sort of the anchor of this, or the beginning point of this alliance. And it's exciting. And then out of nowhere, the Turks and the Pakistanis say to the Saudis, whoa, hold on there. You know what we can do? We can extend our nuclear umbrella over your head. We're Pakistan. We have a nuclear weapon. You're worried about Iran nuclear weapon. Don't go into alliance with Israel. Come with us. We'll protect you. And you don't have to play this game with the infidels. And that's called STEP, or some analysts do call it STEP. Saudi, Turkey, Egypt, Pakistan. So IMEC versus STEP.
Yeah. So what I think that is exactly, and it was born out of the Abraham Accords. The idea actually emerged out of the Saudi-Israeli peace plan. And of course, back then, you heard a lot about the kind of bromance between Narendra Modi and Bibi Netanyahu, that the two of them had a good relationship. The Emiratis had a good relationship with India, and there was just a sense of change in the air. The Greeks and the Cypriots had a good relationship with the Israelis. They also had a good relationship with the UAE. And so it all made sense, right? You could have this energy and product corridor that would benefit the Indians, possibly at the expense of the Chinese, which was really attractive when we were all stressing out here about Belt and Road back at that time, right? That was a big thing, that the Chinese were, creating their own corridors and trade routes that were going to kind of subvert the United States. So if we could kind of screw the Chinese, work with the Indians, foster normalization, and bring energy and goods at a discount to Europe, this is the ultimate pro-American Western alliance that we wanted to build upon. Now, I would say that you fast forward to this war, and there's a couple things going on. On the one hand, as we've talked about, the Saudis are getting nervous because the U.S. can't win. At the same time, the Saudis, the Turks, the Pakistanis, and the Egyptians, all four countries in what we call STEP, this quad, they begin to understand something else, which is that the Iran-led regional order, the sort of ring of fire that the Iranian regime had been wielding, and the power that Iran was projecting all around the region, was beginning to lose steam. It doesn't mean that America was performing perfectly. It doesn't mean that Israel was their savior. It just means they could see the changing dynamics of the Middle East. Hamas was getting weaker. Hezbollah was getting weaker. The Assad regime had already collapsed. Iraq, there's a lot of pressure right now for these Shiite militias to get expunged from there. So there's this general sense that Iran just doesn't have the same power projection. And so what you have is these four countries. You got to remember, the Iranians, Shiites, 20% of the Muslim world, not particularly loved by the general population there. These four countries are Sunni, right? And they are the four core countries. You got Pakistan with its nukes. You got Saudi with its religious fervor and the custodians of the holy mosques. The Turks, second largest army in NATO, and Egypt, well, the former capital of the Arab world. I think the Saudis are now the current. Anyway, they saw this opportunity to maybe start to surge on Sunni power and to really begin to flex a bit more. So I think that's one. And once they realized that, well, they could slam Israel quite a bit. They've been hammering the Israelis about the war in the Middle East and genocide in Gaza and all kinds of other ridiculous claims. They've really used their megaphone. And if you go back and you look at a lot of their statements over the last year or so, it's been pretty vitriolic. So they found common cause in beating up on Israel. And then I think they began to turn their sights on this IMEC, this India, Middle East, Europe corridor. And what they began to see is that they had common enemies throughout this alliance, right? You got the Pakistanis, they love nothing more than to screw the Indians. You got the Turks. Man, do they want to screw the Greeks and the Cypriots and the Israelis. The Saudis, they have this new rivalry that we've been watching with UAE. So they get to stick it to the UAE and they get to reroute this, corridor. They're talking about maybe routing it through Syria, another Sunni state that was once Alawite. So now they get to kind of brag about this, and they get to completely work around the Israelis and against the Greeks. From their perspective, it's a John Grisham ending. It's the perfect end of this story. And so what we're watching right now is this, I think, friction between these two corridors. What's really interesting to me is I had an opportunity to talk to a Saudi diplomat, a week ago. It was right after this defense structure was announced. And I said, it really does look like you guys are going to try to screw over all those IMEC partners. And what this diplomat said, and it's interesting, very Saudi, hey, why do we have to choose? Why can't we be part of both? And my answer is because the Turks and the Pakistanis don't want you to. And you're going to have to choose. But at least according to the Saudis right now, hey, we can actually dance at two weddings with one tukka, so to speak, and we can make this work. I'm not sure they can, but at least that's what they're telling analysts in Washington right now who are concerned about the fate of IMEC.
So we can see here in broad brush, everything that we were concerned about at the beginning of the war, which was a failure to define what the terms of victory would be. You wrote a piece for commentary in our previous issue about how to win a war when your combatant or your enemy won't acknowledge defeat. Here we have a situation in which Iran certainly hasn't won anything and it's lost a lot, but it has not been defeated. And you can see the geopolitical consequences of an American effort that has no determined conclusion, or that where there's a clear picture that American interests have been served and advanced in what's gone on here. And this is the cost. The cost is that the Saudis, almost ready to create a new geopolitical fact in this trading route, are backing away from it and looking elsewhere, away from the West, into the Sunni Muslim world for comfort and safety, as opposed to being part of the entrepreneurial, more Western culture that MBS seemed to want to join.
Yeah, I mean, I think that is a consequence. I should note here that so far this defense alliance has done very little. In fact, we saw Houthi attacks against a Saudi oil facility, I don't know, a week ago. And, it's not like the Pakistanis lifted a finger here. It's not like Turkey lifted a finger. I mean, there was a very harshly worded statement that was read out loud by the Pakistanis. And that was pretty much the end of that incident. And so if the Saudis are saying, well, America's feckless, well, okay, Pakistan, I'm not sure they're going to be coming to your rescue here. So, let's not get too excited about this. There is no real plans for a rerouted trade corridor. There's talk about reviving what they call the Hijaz Railway, which would go from basically Saudi Arabia through Syria and then onward to Turkey. But the plans for that, I think, are pretty much still fuzzy and in the making. So I think that, yes, that the vacuum created by our inability to end this war on clear and concrete terms has definitely jostled the Saudis. And I think they're looking around wondering, how to protect themselves in the midst of this, serious period of uncertainty. And it is real uncertainty obviously for everybody. I think the Israelis are wondering too, hey, can we end this thing? Because, their fate depends on the United States being able to deliver the goods. I'm sure the Emiratis are thinking this way. I think a lot of countries are. What's just so interesting is that, the Saudis kind of jumped ship pretty early here, or at least that's what that's what appears to have happened. What I think we don't know is, what is Donald Trump saying about this? Because just days before this announcement was made, he offered them civil nuclear power. That was a pretty massive concession. And I think on the same exact day, if I'm not mistaken, the Greeks are shooting down missiles in the skies over Saudi Arabia. So here you've got IMEC partners and the United States working to help keep the Saudis safe. By the way, the Israelis were shooting down missiles as their F-35s are over the skies over Iran. They're protecting the entire Arab world with no thank you either. And it looks like there's been a lot that was invested here. And the Saudis just kind of looks like, at least right now, it looks like they're ready to burn it all down. And I want to know, has Donald Trump said, hey, MBS, get your act together. This is insane. Get back to the table. We want you to finish this thing with Israel. We want you to lock in IMEC. And this is going to be the way that we start bringing oil and goods out of the Strait of Hormuz. We're going to steer it away from there. We're going to bring it across the mainland. And we're going to solve a lot of the problems that you're struggling with right now. And by the way, be patient, because the economic war against Iran, it's going to work. I think there was probably something that happened that led MBS to say, you know what, no matter what happens, I'm not there anymore. I think we're ready to try something else. I think he'll regret this. I think he's going to regret the new alliance that he's gotten into, which I don't think will have much teeth. I think you're watching the Saudis kind of flail about here right now at a moment of great uncertainty in the Middle East.
Jonathan, this leads me right into the question that I had been sitting on for you, which is short of winning the war in Iran, and we don't have to get into what that means, but by some definition, if the U.S. wins the war in Iran, short of that, are there real inducements that Trump could offer? Are there other policies that Trump could dangle before the Saudis to make them make the right binary choice?
I mean,
without us winning.
Yeah. I mean, look, the civil nuclear thing, it's not a done deal. It was dangled, and then he said, well, the Saudis need to normalize with Israel in order to get it done. But that's one real inducement, and apparently didn't do enough to sway MBS. I think that the F-35 has also been dangled before the Saudis, and that's something that if we could hasten the delivery of those, which I'm not saying would be a good idea. I'm not sure that civil nuclear power is a good idea either for the Saudis, but these are things that Donald Trump can and could continue to dangle. Trying to raise capital for some of these mega projects that have started to falter. Now, some of those things may be born of engineering issues that were maybe a bit aggressive. They were really trying to push the envelope on what was even possible with what they were trying to build. But, getting more help from the United States probably seems, like something that could nudge them. But I will also say that, the Saudis have they've got some longstanding misgivings about even Trump, which is interesting because Trump has really been their champion. You probably recall the attack on the Saudi oil facility of Abqaiq back in 2018, right? This was an attack sponsored by the Iranians, hits this facility. It's like one of the most important facilities of oil production in Saudi Arabia, which is one of the most important oil producers in the world, probably the most important from the U.S. perspective. And, this arrangement that we've been talking about, this security for energy, was always kind of that was the architecture, right? And when the United States did not respond to that attack immediately, I think that was the moment that probably shook MBS to his core. That he began to realize that even Donald Trump was not willing to lock horns with the Iranians over something like this. And I think we've been on shaky ground for a while. So even with all of the offerings from Donald Trump and the talk of normalization and building out the Saudi economy and working with the Saudis to become major powers in the region may not be enough. I think the mixed messaging, the lack of a directed foreign policy, by the way, interrupted by 4 years of Biden, where the relationship between Saudi and America went into the toilet. I mean, you'll recall Joe Biden refused to shake the hand of MBS because of the Jamal Khashoggi affair. And they forced the Saudis to end the war against the Houthis, which, if you think about it right now, man, had we just let the Saudis unleash on the Houthis and let them finish that war, think about the kind of place that we'd be in right now. I'm sure all of this is kind of lingering in the back of the mind of MBS. Again, not to say that this man's perfect, not to say that, I'm not saying he deserves more. I am saying, though, that you've got to look at American foreign policy critically enough to be able to see where we've done a good job and maybe where we've tripped up. And I think we've tripped up more than a few times when it comes to Saudi. They've tripped up plenty, but so have we.
Jonathan Schanzer, thank you so much. Please, everybody, go to commentary.org right now, if you're not a subscriber, subscribe so you can read John's piece, The Saudi Choice That Will Reshape the Middle East, in our September issue. So, Jonathan, always a pleasure. Abe, thank you very much. I'm John Podhoretz. Keep the candle burning.